balayé of Glare, agus Green Mahagat of Randoin, a Sochtan Curve, a Hayward Loher and you. I do hope that Mickey Hart knows that a Tyrone man has been commemorated in Cavan, because it'll come as some surprise to him, that even if he did have Cavan antecedents. So one of the things which I'm trying to do here is actually try to piece religion, how that fits into the matrix of identity in the 1640s in Ireland. And it's something which remains topical, and I think we just have to look at the American election, because if we look at religion in broad terms as a faith culture, then we can see that motivates people in odd ways. And it's very important to try to assemble the jigsaw of how attitudes of faith can underpin very important political movements and become mapped onto different social and political configurations. Now, in the latter part of the 1640s, Eoghan Rua Ó Neill's Ulster army came to style itself as the army of the Pope. That was at least partially because it was direct contributions from the papal nuncio Giambattista Rinuccini, which allowed the army to be readied for what subsequently became its most important victory at Benburb in June 1646. Now, despite a somewhat tense relationship, which began with underwhelming first impressions and was pockmarked with later misunderstandings, Rinuccini ultimately came to regard O'Neill and his military associates as vital aspects of the more ardent and trustworthy Catholic party among the Confederates. The standards that O'Neill's army captured at Benburb, for instance, were ultimately exported to Rome to figure prominently in a triumphalist victory procession and eventually to displace older captured Turkish banners in Santa Maria Maggiore. This view of O'Neill as a particularly zealous Catholic was echoed by the nuncio's posthumous Irish Capuchin apologists, Richard O'Farrell and Robert O'Connell, in their monumental Latin history of the Confederate Wars and their aftermath, which is now generally known by its 20th century title as the Commentarius Rinuccinianus. In an even more unvarnished fashion, Eoghan Rua Ó Néill figures as the Catholic paragon of the often vitriolic English language narrative, the aphorismical discovery of treasonable faction, whose anonymous author very frequently uses the sobriquet of the Catholic General for O'Neill. Yet most of the evidence of the religious practices, at least I'm not walking around, I'm famous for falling off the rostrum in UCD. Most of the evidence of the religious attitudes, practices and beliefs concerning O'Neill himself and his officers and troops is frustratingly external. The general and his army chiefly figure in the reports, letters and accounts of those who wrote about them rather than in their own words. Consequently, piecing together an understanding of their religious culture is frequently dependent on a web of hints and inferences and possibly unreliable evidence. For example, the extraordinarily interesting pre-battle oration which O'Neill possibly gave prior to Benburb, which I'll be analysing later, may in fact be entirely the product of the anonymous author of the aphorismical discovery's own pen, or it may follow quite closely what O'Neill actually said, or it may lie somewhere between these two extremes as a gilded, sharpened and refined account of the general's words. Nor was the Ulster army itself completely homogeneous. O'Neill himself, as we have learned, had been absent from Ireland for almost 40 years in Spanish military service when he returned in 1642. Several hundreds of the officers in the army were also returning exiles, including his son Henry, who was probably representative of quite a number of second generation exiles who'd probably been born abroad and were in all likelihood coming back to Ireland for the first time as adults. The great bulk of the rank and file, however, were native to the island. Relatively few ordinary soldiers were released from continental service to return from the island during a decade when the principal Catholic powers were heavily engaged in warfare of their own. And anyway, only recent recruits could have really returned because statistically after 5 years in an early modern army, you were dead. It's not certain at all that these ordinary troops were all men of Ulster, But the probability is that for most of the decade, Ulster soldiers dominated O'Neill's army. And in order to look at the religious culture there, we need to look at the province of Ulster a little bit in the decades prior to 1641. And I'm not going to talk about the 9 Years' War, although it should be borne in mind that the late 1640s and 50s were a catastrophic era of demographic collapse for Ireland as a whole. The latter part of the 9 Years' War was probably almost as bad for Ulster, in the sense that you have a programme of deliberate ethnic cleansing and murder and killing of the civilian population by English troops, which is aimed to do two things. One is to depopulate the area, sparing nobody in the latter part of the 9 Years' War, attacking villages and killing everybody in them, but even more importantly, trying to destroy the food supply of the province. So and as I say, it is unquantifiable how many of the Ulster population died, but one of the reasons why the Ulster plantation did not promote more immediate violence was the fact that so much of the Ulster population was killed at the end of the 9 Years' War. Now, leaving that aside, in the decades prior to 1641, Ulster had become a roiling centre of many different kinds of interconnecting tensions. As a result of plantation, colonial spread, and an opportunity, anything goes economy for those who could make use of it, a migrant population had speckled itself throughout the entire province and indeed the entire island. Now, as we know today, migration of any kind can be productive of tension, even Dublin families, for instance, into a town like Maynooth. But the disruptive effect of this process of migration into Ulster was amplified by ethnic differences. The English and Scots newcomers spoke a different language. They wore different clothes, including strange underclothes that, according to Fynes Morrison, the Gaelic Irish called the English shitebreeks. For their part, the colonists were convinced of their own ethnic superiority and of the cultural inferiority of the native population. One pamphlet touting for migrants to staff the plantation promised equal enjoyment from hunting wolves and Irish woodkern. Visceral economic tensions developed. As a group, the newcomers did outstandingly well. Not only were they granted enormous tracts of confiscated land, but they were the subject of continued, sustained, positive discrimination on the part of the state, and were culturally suited to the emerging money economy in Ulster in a way that the native population could not match. They rapidly began to engross the best agricultural land available, driving the native population to more marginal holdings, often at exploitative rents. A pattern developed where even relatively rich Gaelic families, which had been granted land in the plantations, found themselves slipping into debt and mortgaging lands. Even relatively low status English migrant artisans could become involved in this pattern of money lending and debt acquisition. This helped create enormous and explosive status inconsistencies. Gaelic society was intensely hierarchical. Consequently, the resentment of the burgeoning wealth of perceived upstarts of low social class was particularly enormous. Underpinning this process of turmoil was a predatory state with a tradition of reliance on easily abused commissions of martial law, which gave the power of capital punishment and confiscation of property into the hands of selected members of this new migrant population. Acting as a capstone and intersecting with these other tensions was the issue of religious difference. In any early modern society, religion played a central role in regulating and explaining human behaviour. Belief in divine providence, that God rewarded good deeds and punished sin, was ubiquitous. Most education was orientated towards religious purposes, and as a group, religious professionals, the clergy, generally exceeded the formal educational qualifications of the vast majority, if not all, the population. Their task was to steer the people towards the meritorious behaviours that would give them the best chance possible to attain eternal salvation and God's favour in this world as well. Now, the first 4 decades of the 17th century saw an increasingly effective movement of Catholic preaching and education all over Ireland, including Ulster. While much of this involved little more than teaching very basic prayers and simple moral behaviours, the Catholic clergy saw one of their most important tasks as protecting their flocks from wolves in sheep's clothing, namely Protestants. Throughout Europe, and Ireland was no exception, the basic beliefs and doctrines of mainstream Protestants and Catholics were overwhelmingly shared. But the clergy of all confessions were exceptionally good at highlighting the relatively minor differences. Rather than a form of Christianity, Catholics considered Protestants as heretics whose beliefs represented a perversion of true religion in the devil's interest. All over Ulster, Franciscan friars, often better educated than the parish clergy, provided supplementary preaching, which, if it reflected the tone of the writings which have survived, was vitriolic in the extreme and was full of ad hominem attacks on Protestant reformers, particularly Luther and Calvin, that emphasised their depravity, their pact with the devil, and their fleshly appetites. For their part, Protestants in Ireland overwhelmingly denied that Catholicism was a valid branch of Christianity and considered it the religion of Antichrist. The collapse of the English state in Ireland in 1641 was precipitated by an uprising in Ulster which gradually spread throughout the island. Originally conceived as a type of coup d'etat, the rebellion rapidly took on a life of its own as local populations mounted attacks on English settlers. Typically, these attacks saw English families being confronted in their homes by larger groups of locals who plundered their property, destroyed their documents, stripped them, and then expelled them. Some were murdered even at this early stage, but the majority who died fell victim to exposure as they sought refuge elsewhere. Such attacks represented a violent expression of the economic, social, and political resentments that the local communities had been nurturing for decades. The settlers were perceived as exploitative, foreign, repressive immigrants and upstarts receiving their just deserts. Such incidents corresponded to what can be described as a pattern of subaltern violence, namely violence perpetrated by a collective that believes itself to have been oppressed, marginalised, and persecuted by a dominant grouping. We can think, for instance, of peasant revolts, we can think of slave revolts, we can perhaps think of the violence which occurred in Israel/Palestine in October the 7th of last year in this regard. Violence of this kind has often been observed to take great delight in humiliating its victims for a complex matrix of motivations. As revenge and payback for the indignities previously suffered, as a response to the fear of future repression, and also from the need to combat and repress feelings of admiration for the victims. In the 1650s, a Capuchin friar on the continent emphasised the persecution of the Irish in talking about the 1641 rebellion. The Irish reaction in 1641 was the response to sustained oppression. Let me only add that the English and Scottish heretics practised such autocratic rule against the Catholics of Ireland in the reign of James and Charles that the long-lasting peace extending unbroken from 1603, when James began his reign, down to 1641, when the Irish began the war, was a long drawn-out martyrdom for very many leaders and nobles of Ireland and other natives of lower status. And this autocratic rule was a device for destroying the people one by one, applied, even if not planned with this purpose, and far crueler than even the most disordered wars. For in wars, resistance is offered to raiders and rioters, but during that long-lasting period, which too freely permitted wrongdoing, the heretical officials and private wastrels under their command, who adhered to the same doctrines, were allowed to engage in theft without punishment, since the Irish did not dare to oppose force to force for fear of something worse happening to them. And he went on to say, how much more wisely then and better would the English and Scots have managed their own affairs if they had set limits to their greed and savagery? For what was to be expected from people who had been finally provoked to lose their long and great patience by the scum of heretical newcomers in their native land, and from people who recall their ancestral freedom, than that they would want to avenge the very many great wrongs of the past and those which they still suffered, and to attempt to force to free themselves from their present slavery and the greater evils which were threatening them, and to sacrifice to the rage of the people those who had devised their mighty woes. For this is the unvarying end of wrong and violent government among all peoples. If they had not driven innocent people who had long borne with a calm demeanour because of their love of God, their practically slavish status, into that war, at the beginning of which, in a period of just 2 months, we read that 200,000 heretics were slaughtered in a variety of ways. And very interesting that although that didn't happen, that 200,000 heretics were slaughtered, the Capuchin friar of Ferrol is prepared to accept the Tempelian or the Jones Protestant view of the number of casualties at this point in time. Now, religion is certainly not absent from this retrospective analysis. Catholics had been the victim of persecution, and those who persecuted were heretics. But the friar emphasised the legal, political and economic dimensions of these wrongs rather than any purely religious aspect. Nevertheless, these two critical categories of Catholic and heretic were of fundamental importance in stabilising the identities of the goodies and the baddies of his narrative. These religious classifications provided an underpinning justification for the dehumanisation of the settler population, which mobilised not merely secular tensions, but a conception of the world and its history put forward and sustained by the educated clerical elite. In the original rebellion, certain types of religiously orientated violence became apparent and were captured in the depositions made by surviving Protestants. John Parry, for instance, recalled that upon the burning of Armagh, the rebels killed such Protestants as they found in their way, and after stripping them, laid the sacred Bible and the privy parts of some of them in contempt of the same, as William Doolan, who, as he told his deponent, was an eyewitness, informed him. He also noted that Thomas Chambers, Esquire, told this deponent that one Patrick Carrach O'Cullen, opening the sacred Bible, pissed upon the same, saying, "If I could do worse with it, I would." This first action was clearly intended as an action of contempt and detestation of the bodies and Bibles of the dead Protestants. Laying their scriptures and the naked sex organs of the corpses degraded something sacred to them through contact with their genitals. This ignominious treatment of the dead bodies not only tore away their modesty, but revealed their weakness and incapacity to prevent their shame. In addition, a consistent theme in Irish clerical polemic during this period was that Protestants made use of Scripture to justify their own indulgence in fleshly appetites. In 1617, for instance, the Jesuit annual letter from Ireland highlighted this trope. Just as our innovators professed the doctrine of sola scriptura, they assert that sacred scriptures has no sense and contains only precepts. Accordingly, when the Scottish pseudo-bishop of Meath prepared to take another wife after the first had died by St. Paul, he said it is necessary for a bishop to be the husband of one wife, but he dexterously met this with the same apostle: it is better to marry than to burn, and having played thus with Scripture, he entered matrimony. The sexualisation of the Protestant Bible that Parry makes reference to may have echoed this type of Catholic accusation that Protestantism contaminated holy impulses towards celibacy and asceticism, and instead corrupted religion for carnal purposes. In addition, as the great historian of the French Wars of Religion, Nathalie Zeman-Davis, has argued, degradation of the falsely sacred could serve as a rite of purification, returning it back to the profane sphere where it belonged. O'Cullen's uriny contempt for Protestant scriptures was clearly performative to both his fellow rebels and the humiliated Protestants. In Fermanagh, Edward Slack later recalled that on the 24th of October last, the said rebels took this deponent's Bible, opened it, and laying it in the open side in a puddle of water, leapt and stamped upon it. The rebels then declared, "A plague of this book hath bred all this quarrel," and they hoped that within 3 weeks, all the Bibles of this land in Ireland should be used as that was, and worse, and that none should be left in the kingdom. Similarly, here in Cavan, it was reported that Patrick O, dwelling in Levenali in the parish of Kill, burned the church Bible, saying that it was the words of the devil, and that we, the Protestants, were unchristened people. As well as deliberately offending and humiliating Protestants, it's possible that there was an element of religious revenge in these actions for past Protestant treatment of objects and sites important to Catholics, such as the destruction of the infrastructure of St. Patrick's Purgatory in 1632. In a certain way, too, acts of religious violence were acts of faith. In a providentialist world, where it was believed that God directly punished sinful behaviour, Catholics could demonstrate the strength of their convictions concerning the devilish nature of heresy through violation of its sacred objects without fear of incurring divine retribution. As the religious professionals on the ground, the Catholic clergy were certainly happy to see those they considered heretics being expelled from localities. They relished the repossession of churches by Catholics, and they supported actions such as the destruction of Bibles and the exhumation of Protestant corpses from graveyards as part of the process of purification of sacred sites. Contrary to what became the accepted Protestant narrative of events, however, which ascribed this chief responsibility of the rising to the Catholic clergy and which insisted that they aspired to the total genocide of the settler population, in some respects, priests and friars, and even more evidently the bishops when they came to meet in March 1642, acted as forces of restraint. This was most evident in the pattern which developed in which Protestants who agreed to convert were allowed to remain in rebel-controlled areas. While not very common, this process of turning to mass occurred throughout the country and was clearly influenced by the desire of the clergy to impose some degree of religious framework on the chaos. If the original rebellion of October 1641 exposed gaping fissures between the almost entirely immigrant Protestant population and their native counterparts, the war that followed massively deepened the divide. Individual murders were certainly committed from an early stage, but larger atrocities began to accumulate as settlers struck back with savagery and Catholics responded with mass revenge killings. The arrival of English troops to confront the rebellion heightened this pattern, and the Scottish army landed in East Ulster in 1642 and immediately embarked on a campaign of fairly indiscriminate massacre and ethnic cleansing. This was the Ulster into which Eoghan Rua Ó Néill landed in June 1642, describing his native province like a hell, if there could be a hell on earth. Having been abroad for 4 decades, he was struck also by the barbarity of the native population, many of them little better in their ways than the most remote Indians, and he described his soldiers as behaving no better than animals. Having been employed by a continental power for 40 years, O'Neill's personal religious sensibilities were probably relatively close to the Gaelic Irish Catholic clergy, particularly Franciscan friars of the type who had served as his regimental chaplains in Flanders and now who fill the same role in the Ulster Army. He was accustomed to fighting against heretics, but in an organised military context governed by relatively robust conventions of warfare and assumptions concerning acceptable soldierly behaviour. Adapting these to Ireland was difficult. As a commander, O'Neill placed a paramount importance in discipline, which was the key to effective operations in the field, but he also recognised the difficulty in maintaining rigid discipline without access to regular pay and an adequate commissary, which he almost invariably lacked. His first years in Ireland were a period of relatively limited achievement. It was the arrival of the papal mission to Ireland in late 1645, which helped to elevate his importance within the Confederate Association. Rinuccini's first impressions of O'Neill were of a taciturn and unforthcoming individual. The nuncio's chief lieutenant in Ireland was Dionisio Massari, the Dean of Fermo, who initially also got off on the wrong foot with the general. Having been sent to O'Neill by Rinuccini to ascertain what supports he needed from the supplies that the papal representatives had brought to Ireland, Massari and his superior were both surprised at the moderation of O'Neill's demands. When O'Neill later realised that he could have asked for more and tried to do so, it led to a heated exchange with Massari. In the end, O'Neill received about a third of the papal supplies, half of what went to the Leinster army. Despite the fact that by March 1646, Rinuccini believed that Ulster was the most Catholic province in Ireland and professed a singular reverence to the Supreme Pontiff. Helping to sustain this view of the Gaelic Irish of Ulster, whom he described as accustomed by nature to suffer and inured to the cold of that northern climate, they desire little and have need of little. Without bothering with bread, they live on grasses and butter. They drink milk and as a great delicacy whisky. They hardly have shoes and a few objects. They cover themselves with a mantle of wool. They care more for the state of their swords and muskets than their own bodies. They rarely touch money and rarely quarrel about it. On a later occasion, he referred to the Ulster soldiers as by nature quite barbarous, although good Catholics. As a result, though he retrospectively regretted it, he allocated more money to the Leinster army, which was closer in its habits and expectations to places such as England or Flanders. After he'd left Ireland, he continued to believe that the Gaelic Irish, whose centre of gravity he located in Ulster, were more committed to Catholicism and thus more meritorious, but in a somewhat condescending fashion, described them as rough in their manner of living and often of slow comprehension, of less ability in negotiations. Masari echoed some of these attitudes, referring to but in less ethnographically superior terms, referring to the Ulster people as so Catholic and reverential to the Holy See. It was the Battle of Benburb which marked the first major change in Rinuccini's attitudes towards O'Neill, from considering him rather unfortunately irremovable from post, despite his erratic and grasping nature, to a much greater enthusiasm. Aside from money and arms, Rinuccini had apparently authorised a leading Irish Franciscan, Boethius MacEoghan, to join the Ulster army with the power to offer a plenary indulgence, that is, complete remission of sins, to its soldiers. Prior to the battle, the army was apparently commanded to kneel and were granted a general absolution and received the indulgence. MacEoghan then led them through a rosary and other prayers. The choice of prayers particularly dedicated to the Virgin Mary was hardly by accident. One of the chief fault lines between European Catholicism and Protestantism in the 17th century concerned the practice of intercessory prayer. Protestants rejected the idea that prayers could be directed to anyone but God, while Catholics continued to insist that saints, who enjoyed special merits in God's eyes, could be used as advocates and intermediaries who could be appealed to canvass God's favour. At the very apex of this system was the Virgin Mary, whose intercessory prayers were believed to carry particular weight with her Son. As a mother and a woman, Mary was also conceived as a particularly tender-hearted and merciful figure to whom wretched sinners could appeal despite deserving nothing but punishment. Another religious fault line concerned the use of images in worship. Many Protestants were intensely suspicious of pictures and statues, believing that they led to superstitious reverence of mere objects as being invested with sacred power, whereas Catholics were much more tolerant of the idea that images could help worshippers, particularly the more uneducated, to open their hearts and to provide a focus for devotion. Protestants were especially opposed to images of saints on the grounds that these could become the focus of actual idolatry. Iconoclasm, the removal and destruction of sacred images and statues, thus became a feature of the early Reformation across Europe, including a vast amount of material representing the Virgin Mary, by far and away the most important saint from a Catholic perspective. Such behaviours made it easy for Catholics to believe and accuse Protestants of despising the Virgin Mary. Ostentatious reverence for Mary thus developed into something of a touchstone of Catholic belief, an easy way for people to identify their religious allegiance and to direct anger at Protestants without necessarily understanding the theological debates concerned. According to a Protestant witness, the battle cry of the Ulster Irish at Benburb was Santa Maria, and Eoghan Rua Ó Néill encouraged his troops that by God's assistance and the intercession of his Blessed Mother and all the holy saints in heaven, they would enjoy victory. The chief Catholic source for the battle offers a slightly different perspective on Eoghan Rua Ó Néill's speech, although it highlights the religious dimension of his discourse. In this account, O'Neill seems to have reminded his soldiers that they had previously committed horrible sins by pillaging the inhabitants of Leinster, but the indulgence now permitted those to be forgiven. He also insisted on the justice of their cause, since they were fighting for religion in the first place. We offer to maintain the religion taught by our Saviour, preached by the apostles, planted in Ireland by our holy patron St. Patrick, and held ever since by our predecessors. Wherefore call to God Almighty for assistance, who cannot deny you the same according his own divine covenant. You never heard justice forsaken by God, nor the cry of the poor, forlorn and religious condemned. If in this battle killed, you triumph with God in heaven. If to shun death you fly, you triumph, and leave your fellow soldiers in action, you will be no better esteemed in the world than bloody Cain, who murdered his own innocent brother Abel. In this account, therefore, O'Neill seems to have emphasised the justice of his army's cause, which necessarily would receive divine assistance. Now, using religious ideas to bolster the courage and determination of his soldiers, of course, made religious sense for any general. In addition, whatever his actual words were, we can only glimpse them through the filter of these accounts. But even if he did not express them in these precise manners, it seems probable that O'Neill's personal beliefs were consonant with these ideas. They would have been entirely conventional to the educated clergy of Ulster, with whom O'Neill was on generally close terms. Moreover, since he probably did make a speech before the battle, it's likely that he would have been eager to stress points that he thought would be effective, which offers some indication that his troops shared this framework of belief. According to the Catholic account, O'Neill also highlighted religion in his depiction of his army's enemies, interweaving it with Catholic reasons for hatred of them. Those that you see before your faces there, ready to spill your blood, are those that profane your churches, turned your altars and sanctuaries to beastly mangers, to stew houses and other barbarous uses, murdered and killed your friends and allies, both men, women and child, turned your sweet native country to desolation. All that was dear to you is demolished by fire and sword. The victory at Benburb fundamentally altered the nuncio's perception of O'Neill, but their future relationship was not without its tensions. Rather than entrust the campaign against Dublin to O'Neill alone in the autumn of 1646, Rinuccini gave in to pressure from a number of advisers and adopted a worst of all possible approaches of combining both the Ulster and Leinster armies together, which helped to ensure its failure. While the Leinster general, Thomas Preston, and Rinuccini himself were both far more culpable than O'Neill in this fiasco, Rinuccini was critical of the Ulster commander too, suspecting him of posing as a defender of religion to increase his own power. He was angry that O'Neill did not immediately move on Dublin after the crisis of peace developed, which he ascribed to O'Neill's desire to sack Kilkenny. And he believed that O'Neill's desire for self-aggrandisement helped destabilise Preston's loyalty to the Confederate cause. Tension then developed over the fortress of Athlone. This had previously been held for the Royalist Party by Viscount Dillon, but had been captured and put under the command of one Tibbet Macaulay. Dillon subsequently converted to Catholicism when received into the church by the nuncio himself. The General Assembly of the Confederate Catholics ordered that Athlone be handed back to his command, which O'Neill resisted strenuously, not least because he entertained justifiable suspicions about Dillon's commitment to the Confederate cause. Rinuccini was deeply offended by this insubordination. Not only did he take personal pride in Dillon's conversion, but he hoped it would prove an inspiration to others. In addition to issues concerning the nuncio's vanity, this particular clash between them centred on a certain worldly pragmatism on the part of the general and a somewhat naive religious enthusiasm on Rinuccini's part. In Rinuccini's world, Dillon's conversion had to trump other considerations, and he was deeply angered by O'Neill's behaviour. Relations soured further because of the behaviour of O'Neill's army, which had been quartered in Leinster after the Dublin campaign. Deliberately starved of resources after the convening of the General Assembly, the soldiers resorted to forcibly extorting supplies from the local population. Rinuccini was outraged at their depredations, and matters became worse on the 26th of April when a sizable body of women congregated on his house in Kilkenny, claiming redress from him since the Ulster army styled itself as the army of the Pope. The nuncio was incandescent with anger at the besmirching of the Pope's name and the implication that he was responsible for the army's sins, and his fury was probably increased by the fact that the complaints were by women, which probably indicated complaints about sexual violence as well as other crimes, and he did not consider that O'Neill's hanging of several offenders was a sufficient response. Nor did the reputational damage to the nuncio end quickly. A month later, it was reported that when Rinuccini passed a village on his journeys, the common people run and cry after him, cursing him, and all who sent him to Ireland to create ruin there and to cause so many families to die of hunger. They go and cry in the same way before his house in Kilkenny, throwing stones against the window, and this because he supports O'Neill. These factors fed into the nuncio's support for the idea that in 1647 O'Neill's army should be diverted into Connaught. The general himself was deeply uneager to go. Rinuccini not only wanted to put an end to the depredations of the troops in Confederate Leinster, but he was fired by enthusiasm that a successful campaign could liberate and reopen St. Patrick's Purgatory. Rinuccini was filled with religious enthusiasm at this prospect. Now, there's little reason to believe that O'Neill wouldn't have liked to reopen St. Patrick's Purgatory, But Tadhg had no strategic military importance whatsoever, so it didn't figure on his list of priorities. In the event, the destruction of Preston's army at Dungan's Hill in August 1647 necessitated O'Neill's urgent recall, and following the destruction of the Munster army at Knocknanuce in November, he commanded the only significant army left to the Confederates. These circumstances made many Confederates eager to jump at the opportunity of concluding a truce with Inchiquin in 1648. Now, despite his past difficult relationship with O'Neill, Rinuccini had no hesitation in opposing this and dismissing the idea that a truce with Inchiquin's heretical forces could possibly be seen as better than protecting Confederate territory in Munster and Leinster with O'Neill's Ulster forces. His attitudes in this regard were consistent with his position concerning Athlone in early 1647. Religious considerations should always trump narrow political reasoning. The excommunication crisis of 1648 probably marked the first real warmth on the nuncio's part towards the Ulster general. He was touched by the general's humility and reverence for his office at a time when the nuncio himself had become something of a fugitive. But O'Neill's performance in the ensuing Confederate Civil War soured the relationship further. Not only did the Ulster general lose, but when Rinuccini was besieged in Galway, he was surprised that O'Neill made no real attempt to come to his assistance. In his later relation to the Pope, he contrasted O'Neill's behaviour sharply with that of Colonel Roger Maguire, whom he described as a soldier of the greatest valour and a most perfect Catholic, who apparently reproved the Ulster general sharply for not going to Rinuccini's aid. This particular incident had some parallel with the Connaught campaign of the previous year. For Rinuccini, a largely religiously inspired objective, such as restoring St. Patrick's Purgatory or protecting the dignity of the Pope's representative in Ireland, could legitimately be factored into military planning. O'Neill was more pragmatic in his choice of targets, although in this instance it could be noted that he did agree to send Maguire to Connaught with a detachment of the Ulster army, which ultimately was defeated and Maguire was killed. Of interest also in the current discussion is the manner in which Rinuccini so warmly praised Maguire's Catholicism. It seems probable in this regard that the characteristic which he most admired was the combination of religious ardour and reverence towards the papal authority which the nuncio represented and which Maguire demonstrated. After his experiences in Galway, Rinuccini was eager to leave Ireland despite O'Neill's efforts to have him remain. One of the reasons he made use of in departing was that even if O'Neill did not come to an accommodation with the excommunicated victors of the Confederate Civil War, who were then completing negotiations to put themselves under the authority of the Marquess of Ormond, he would be obliged to enter some arrangement with parliamentarian forces. Consequently, there would be no party in Ireland which was not cooperating with heretics. If there was an ungenerous dimension to this assessment, Rinuccini was probably entirely correct that this was a scandal that his master could do without. The nuncio had already pushed the boundaries of his authority on behalf of O'Neill on numerous occasions prior to this, but by late 1648 he was exhausted and too dispirited to try to continue. Now, the large corpus of documentation compiled by the papal delegation to Ireland in the 1640s does help to provide an alternative perspective on the religious culture of the Ulster Army and its commanders. In the first place, the Italians left Ireland far more critical of Old English Catholicism than its Gaelic Irish counterpart. Critical in this regard was their belief that papal authority was more respected and reverenced by Gaelic Catholics. While it was easy for their critics to assume that Rinuccini and his companions simply liked having Gaelic Irish Catholics fawn all over them, this was probably too cynical a view. Rinuccini and his colleagues were equally reverential and respectful of the papal office with which they'd been entrusted. In the world of 17th century Catholicism, the authority of the Pope had become, in many respects, the single most important defining characteristic of the true Church. Only that authority could offer a safe path out of the multitude of conflicting religious ideas that not merely divided Protestantism from Catholicism, but seemed constantly to further subdivide Protestantism into different theological camps. Italian nuncios in Poland, it can be noted, demonstrated very similar attitudes to the ones that Rinuccini and his companions showed towards the Gaelic Irish during this time frame. In Poland, they were alert to ethnic differences, but their attitude towards them was always filtered by the overwhelming respect for reverence to Rome as the central Catholic characteristic. A commitment to religious orthodoxy trumps everything else. Rinuccini and the others of his mission did not expect the soldiers of the Ulster Army to be particularly learned or sophisticated in their religious engagement. They were soldiers, living in the world in difficult and dangerous circumstances. Their job was to leave the decision of significant moral considerations to the religious professionals, and above all, to have no truck with heresy. When this was supplemented by bravery and zeal for the cause, then a figure such as Roger Maguire could be considered a most perfect Catholic, perfettissimo cattolico, by Rinuccini. This emphasis on Catholicism, as defined by the touchstone of the Pope, marked a contrast between Italian attitudes and that of most English, Old English and Lowland Scots in their estimation of the Gaelic Irish. While Rinuccini did note, from the perspective of a metropolitan European, what he considered certain barbaric characteristics, as O'Neill himself did when he arrived in Ireland, this was in a sense not relevant to his estimation. His colleague Massari was even more open to Gaelic culture and rather delighted in its ethnic difference and the fact that people so different in their habits and lifestyles shared his own religious culture. Ironically, the somewhat prickly relationship which Rinuccini had with O'Neill may in fact have been influenced by the deportment O'Neill had developed in Spanish service than his Irish identity. It was the general's taciturnity and unreadability which were responsible for a lot of the nuncio's doubts about his ultimate goals and intentions. For the soldiers and officers of the Ulster Army, hatred of heresy came easily because it built upon and legitimised the hatred of heretics and the ethnic, social, political and economic resentments which had accumulated in the province prior to 1641, subsequently intensified by the absolutely brutal warfare of the 1640s. Religion acted as a unifying and binding force and created hope that the fact that they were engaged in God's struggle opened the way for perhaps miraculous divine assistance. O'Neill and his officers seem also to have taken conscious inspiration from the Book of Maccabees in the Old Testament, infusing ethnic identity with religious zeal. The fact that the Ulster Army managed to survive as long as it did in very unpromising circumstances into the 1650s was a product of many factors, including O'Neill's generalship and the peculiar commissary arrangements with the Ulster Cracks. But, as with the more celebrated example of the new model army, the binding power of its religious culture was not without significance. In several different domains, such as providing a sense of purpose, of increasing cohesion, and in allowing the army to receive the patronage and support of the clerical leadership during the 1640s, it was the religion of the army of the Pope which was a critical factor. Many thanks.
Thanks very much, Tadhg. It just shows you, I suppose, how difficult the period was in terms of religious change and religious outlook and everything else, and how nasty it was in a lot of ways. We have time for 1 or 2 questions if anybody has anything they'd like to say. Joe?
Just a small observation. I gather, or I kind of understand that the religious fervour that caused the kind of murder of heretics in inverted commas, etc., that went into the folklore of Protestantism.
Absolutely.
Here, and without any reference to what went before it, and that it would have fed into quite a lot of subsequent sectarianism. And right up to the present day, you would have, if you were talking to members of the Protestant community, they would remember atrocities from 1641, and they would have, there was a great distrust of their Catholic neighbours built in then.
Absolutely. I think if you wanted to take, kind of what's happening in Palestine, Gaza now, for instance, that there would be, an Israeli view would be what happened in that it starts in October 7th, if you like, that this is utterly. So that's the narrative which you have, is that this is awful what happened, whereas a Palestinian narrative would be, well, there's a lot went before that.
There were some shocking atrocities, like throwing people into, there wasn't the famous ones with the lakes and etc.
Portadown, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And they have really gone into the consciousness.
16, you know, in an odd way, the Battle of the Boyne is an invented memory in a way that 1641 wasn't. In the sense that the Battle of the Boyne really emerges more than anything else as you know, in the bicentenary of it. In the late 1890s, so that, you know, for most of Irish history since 1641 was the principal reference point of Protestant identity. What did they take out of it? One, that God allowed this to happen to them because they're providentialists too. So, you know, how, you know, one of the central problems for any religious community in the early modern period is, why do bad things happen to good guys? So what were their sin? Their sin was tolerating idolatry. Their sin was tolerating Catholicism in Ireland. That's why. The second thing was that we were caught by surprise. We didn't know that this was going to come. The third is that the Catholics all want to murder us. So what you get is you get a legitimising narrative that you cannot trust Catholics. You cannot tolerate the Catholic clergy because they are out to commit genocide. And in many ways, you know, the whole thrust of Protestant identity in 18th century Ireland is predicated on a certain interpretation of what 1641 was.
Paisleyism in contemporary times, you will find its origins.
Absolutely, yeah.
We have time for one more, if anyone. Con, yeah.
Yeah, when Bishop Bedell died in 1642, I think, the Catholic Bishop of Kilmore didn't want him buried in the graveyard. I mean, there were places where they actually dug up Protestants as heretics out of graveyards to, you know, and I think the O'Reillys overruled him, and he was buried in the graveyard as he wished in his family tomb there, whatever it is.
Yeah.
That's just an interesting.
Bedell is really interesting in the sense that, you know, he's an absolute sport or an exotic in terms of 17th century Irish Protestantism, and practically all the interest, you know, if you actually look at any interest in the Church of Ireland of evangelizing in the Irish language, it actually goes back to Bedell. And, you know, he had lived in Italy. He had a more sophisticated interaction with Catholicism. But, you know, incredibly, Bedell, one of the recent things that I did was that I was looking at the Bishop of Derry, Downham, in the 1630s. And Downham is a bishop in Derry who writes a book on prayer. And one of the interesting things is that it's a savage attack on Catholicism because it has prayers in a meaningless language, i.e. Latin. And this is the Bishop of Derry, who doesn't speak any Irish, the population of whose diocese is 90% monoglot Gaelophone, who is attacking Catholicism as a religion which does not preach in the language of the people. So Bedell is almost unique in that respect. And one of the very few members of the clergy who, there's an element to which I think he's seen as a kind of well-meaning idiot. That I think there's an element about that with the, you know, kind of that he is recognised as different, qualitatively different to most of the, and of course, you know, he's bitterly resented by his Protestant. By his Protestant co-religionists. You know, I mean, Bedell is involved in a whole series of lawsuits kind of saying, you can't put Gaelic clerics in there. It's illegal. You can't do that.
I think it was...
Sorry, of another conference maybe.
Yeah, well, funny, I'm working on a book of essays about it at the moment, so, but one of the things your colleague Mark Cable said about Bedell was he was a very, very godly man. He was very black and white in a lot of ways, so you didn't want to share an office with him, you know, like, because he'd be so, you know, straight down the line, and this is it and that is that, and you know, there was no give in a lot of ways in relation to like that he had no time, as you say, for his clergy not doing what they were supposed to be doing, or Gaelic clergy being put in, or whatever it was, you know. So yeah. he was very, very tight on a lot of that stuff, and on almost maybe academic in his approach.
Very.
Where a lot of them were. You know, they were academics.
You know, he's interesting in the sense that he actually doesn't need the gig. You know, most of the clergy who get bishoprics in Ireland are relatively younger, they're making their careers, it's a step up. Now, he is promoted to becoming a bishop, which he wasn't particularly interested in, but he was comfortably off in southern England. You know, like, I mean, his wife was absolutely opposed. She was appalled at the idea of coming to Kilmore. You know, like, I mean, there she is, a woman in her late 50s who's, you know, being, you know, uprooted from southern England and sent out into the wilds, you know, and he says, well, she'll just have to put up with it. She is worried, she'll have to put up with that. Again, that's another aspect of him that, you know, both in his, you know, in his career stage and in his attitudes. He's a very, very unusual cleric.
Folks, I think we're going to wrap up now, and there's refreshments outside, but I think we're at 1 o'clock. So we'll be back in seated for 2 o'clock for Con's talk and my own after that. And as I say, there's reenactments going on outside, so if you want to have a look at those as well. But just one more time, just a big thank you to Tadhg and to Eoghan.